Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you heartfelt tales of love, redemption, and second chances. In today's story, we follow Ryan Carter, a self-made millionaire who returns to his hometown after years of chasing success in the big city. What begins as a reluctant trip to fulfill his grandmother's will turns into a journey of self-discovery. As Ryan confronts his past, reunites with his first love, and discovers the son he never knew he had. Join us as we explore how family, forgiveness, and courage can transform a life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for today's story. The late afternoon sun reflected off the black SUV as it wound its way through the familiar roads leading to Ashwood, Vermont. Ryan Carter, gripping the steering wheel with more force than necessary, glanced at the towering trees lining the path, their leaves swaying gently in the breeze. Each tree, each curve of the road, seemed to mock him, dragging up memories he'd locked away for years. He adjusted his sunglasses, trying to focus on the GPS which announced he was only a few miles from his destination. Ashwood, the town he had sworn he would never return to, the place where his life, once full of promise, had unraveled in ways he still didn't fully understand. 15 years had passed since he left for Chicago, determined to carve out a life on his own terms. And he had succeeded. At 35, Ryan was the CEO of Carter Enterprises, a company he had built from the ground up. Wealth, power, and influence all his. Yet as the town center appeared on the horizon, practically unchanged, Ryan couldn't suppress the ache in his chest. The same old square, the same church with its white steeple, the same shops with weathered signs that seemed frozen in time. The reason for his return lay in his grandmother Elizabeth's will. Her passing a month ago had been a blow, though Ryan hadn't spoken to her in years. To claim his inheritance, a fortune even by his standards, Elizabeth had stipulated that he stay in Ashwood for 3 months. He'd convinced himself that the inheritance was worth the inconvenience. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just the money. Something about her final request had unsettled him, stirring a guilt he couldn't quite explain. Pulling up in front of the Ashwood Grand Hotel, the only luxurious accommodation in town, Ryan stepped out of his car and looked around. The street was quiet, the air cool and fragrant with the smell of pine and distant wood smoke. It was exactly as he remembered it, and that made him uneasy. He straightened his jacket, his polished Italian shoes clicking against the pavement as he entered the hotel lobby. The manager greeted him with exaggerated politeness, clearly informed about who his new guest was. Ryan nodded curtly, exchanging minimal pleasantries before being shown to the presidential suite. From the window, he had a sweeping view of the town below. He poured himself a glass of water and stood there for a long moment, letting the memories wash over him. There had been a time when he loved this town, its simplicity, its charm, the people who knew you by name. He had loved Sarah Thompson, too. Her laughter, her resilience, her quiet strength had captivated him from the moment they met at the town library. She had been perched on a ladder, carefully restoring an old book, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. He had offered to help her, and when she turned to look at him, smiling warmly, his world shifted. But that was a lifetime ago. He shook off the thought and decided to take a walk through town. Maybe it would help him settle into this place he had avoided for so long. Dressed impeccably, as always, he strolled down Main Street, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Most of them didn't approach him. His composed, distant demeanor discouraged it. It was when he passed the old ice cream shop that his world came to a halt. Through the large front window, Ryan saw her. Sarah. She looked just as he remembered, her brown hair still soft and wavy, her smile as radiant as ever. But his attention didn't linger on her for long. Sitting beside her, holding her hand, was a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with messy blonde hair and piercing blue eyes that were unmistakably Ryan's. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, It felt as if the world had stopped turning. Memories of his time with Sarah flooded back, their shared dreams. The love they had once fought so hard to protect. And the pain of their final argument. How could she not have told him about the boy? His boy. His legs felt like lead as he pushed open the door to the shop. A bell jingled. And Sarah looked up. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by an expression of shock and, was it fear? She clutched the boy's hand tighter. And he tugged on her arm, pointing excitedly at the colorful display of ice cream, oblivious to the tension. The boy turned to his mother with a bright smile. Ryan opened his mouth to speak. But Sarah moved first. Scooping up the boy in her arms, she hurried toward the back of the shop. By the time Ryan reached the counter, they were gone. "Can I help you, sir?" asked the young employee. Her smile strained as she noticed his obvious distress. "No," Ryan replied, his voice thick with emotion. He turned and left the shop, his thoughts a whirlwind. His son. The boy wasn't just a memory of what could have been. He was real, alive, and growing up without Ryan even knowing he existed. That night, back at the hotel, Ryan sat on the balcony of his suite, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of everything he had buried, the hurt of losing Sarah, the bitterness of their fight, the regret of shutting her out of his life completely, and now, the crushing realization that he had abandoned his own child. Elizabeth had always tried to reach him after he left, but he had ignored her calls, dismissing them as attempts to guilt him into returning to Ashwood. How many times had she wanted to tell him about Jake? And Sarah, how had she managed to raise their son on her own? As the hours dragged on, Ryan thought of the boy's face, those bright blue eyes, so full of curiosity and life. Jake deserved better than the man Ryan had been. And for the first time, Ryan began to wonder if these 3 months in Ashwood were about more than just fulfilling his grandmother's will. Maybe this was his chance to set things right. When dawn broke, Ryan rose from the chair he hadn't left all night. His shoulders felt heavy, but his heart carried a new determination. He didn't know how he would face Sarah, or Jake, or the people of this town who surely remembered the man who had run away. But one thing was clear, he couldn't leave again. Not this time. The morning air was cool and crisp, with the faint scent of pine drifting through the open window of Ryan's suite. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie, but his reflection didn't reassure him. His face, usually composed and confident, carried the weight of unease. How do you confront a past you've tried to bury? And more importantly, how do you face the woman you left behind, knowing the hurt you caused? He didn't have long to dwell on these thoughts. By mid-morning, Ryan found himself walking down the narrow, familiar streets of Ashwood, headed toward the place he knew he had to visit. His grandmother's home, a sprawling Victorian mansion at the edge of town, had always been a symbol of security. Yet now, as the wrought iron gates creaked open, it felt like a monument to his failures. The house was just as he remembered it, majestic, if slightly weathered. In the back garden, the roses his grandmother had adored were still in full bloom. As he approached, he saw her, Carol, the housekeeper who had been with the Carter family for decades, was tending to the flower beds. Her weathered face lit up when she saw him. "You've come back," she said softly, her hands pausing over a rose bush. "Elizabeth always said you would." Ryan hesitated, his voice caught in his throat. "I should have come sooner," he finally managed, his guilt evident. Carol rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her hands. She tried, to tell you, to make you see what was important. Her gaze softened, but her tone carried a quiet reproach. "She wanted you to know about Jake." Hearing his son's name spoken aloud made Ryan's chest tighten. "Why didn't anyone tell me sooner?" he asked, though the answer already weighed heavily on him. Carol shook her head, a mixture of sadness and understanding in her expression. "We tried. Elizabeth called. She wrote letters. Sarah tried too. But you cut yourself off from everything. Ryan. You didn't want to be found. Ryan lowered his head. The memories of those days hitting him hard. The arguments with Sarah. The harsh words exchanged in frustration. Her refusal to move to Chicago. His insistence that he needed more than Ashwood could offer. He had walked away without looking back. Convinced that leaving was the only way to achieve his dreams. But in doing so, he had abandoned more than the town, he had abandoned his family. She was pregnant when I left. Ryan muttered. More to himself than to Carol. And I didn't know. Carol's expression softened. She didn't know either. Not at first. By the time she found out. You were gone. Elizabeth stepped in. Helped her through it all. She became a grandmother to Jake in every way. The weight of that revelation pressed down on Ryan like a mountain. His grandmother, ever wise and loving, had cared for the son he didn't even know existed. She had been there for the moments he had missed, Jake's first steps, his first words, his first day of school. All the milestones Ryan had sacrificed in pursuit of his ambitions. A noise behind the garden fence interrupted his thoughts. Turning, Ryan saw a small face peering through the wooden slats. His heart leapt. It was Jake. The boy's eyes, so bright and curious, locked onto Ryan's. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. The connection between them undeniable. Ryan wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but his voice failed him. Jake tilted his head, as if trying to puzzle out who this stranger was. Jake. A voice called from nearby, breaking the moment. It was Sarah, hurrying toward the fence. Her tone was sharp, but it was the fear in her eyes that caught Ryan's attention. Come here, sweetheart. Jake hesitated, his gaze shifting between his mother and Ryan. Then, reluctantly, he disappeared from view. Sarah met Ryan's eyes through the gap in the fence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was so much to say, yet neither knew where to begin. Sarah. Ryan started, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to talk to you. Her expression was guarded, her arms folded protectively across her chest. We don't have anything to talk about. Ryan. Not after all this time. Please, he pleaded, stepping closer. Just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Something in his tone must have struck a chord, because she sighed, glancing toward the house where Jake had disappeared. Tomorrow. Noon. The diner on Maple Street. But Jake won't be there. I don't want him dragged into whatever this is. Ryan nodded, relief and apprehension washing over him in equal measure. Thank you, he said softly. Sarah didn't respond. She turned and walked away, her shoulders tense. Ryan watched her go, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the wounds he had left behind might take more than an apology to heal. That night, as he sat alone in his grandmother's study, Ryan sifted through old photo albums and letters. One photograph caught his eye, a picture of Elizabeth with a toddler in her arms, his green eyes identical to Ryan's. The boy was smiling, his tiny hand clutching Elizabeth's necklace. Ryan traced a finger over the image, his chest aching with regret. For the first time, he allowed himself to grieve not just for the years he had lost, but for the man he had been. The man who had chosen ambition over love, pride over family. But grief wasn't enough. Ryan knew he had to do more than mourn his mistakes. He had to make things right. And for Jake's sake, he would. The next morning, Ryan rose early. The sun had barely broken over the horizon as he dressed, his resolve stealing with every passing moment. Today, he would face Sarah. Today, he would begin to mend what had been broken. The diner on Maple Street was just as Ryan remembered it, quaint, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. The small space buzzed with quiet conversation, the occasional clink of dishes punctuating the calm. Ryan arrived early, nerves making him feel out of place in a setting that once felt like home. He slid into a booth near the window, where sunlight streamed in. highlighting the scuffed wooden floors. He stared at the menu but didn't read it. His mind too consumed with what he would say to Sarah. How could he explain the choices he had made? The walls he had built around himself? And the regret that had grown with every passing minute since seeing Jake? The bell over the door jingled. And Ryan looked up. Sarah stepped in. Dressed simply in jeans and a sweater. Her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She scanned the room. Her gaze settling on him. For a moment. Her expression softened. And he caught a glimpse of the woman he had once loved with every fiber of his being. But it was gone as quickly as it came. Replaced by the guarded look she had worn since he returned to Ashwood. "Hi," he said as she approached the booth. She nodded but didn't return the greeting. Sliding into the seat across from him. She folded her hands on the table and got straight to the point. "You said you wanted to talk. So talk." Ryan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "First, I want to say I'm sorry. For leaving the way I did. For not coming back sooner. For everything." Her jaw tightened. And she looked away. Her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "Sorry doesn't change what happened, Ryan. It doesn't give Jake back the years he's lost with you." "I know," he replied earnestly. "And I don't expect forgiveness. But I need to try to fix this, to be there for him. For you. In any way I can." Sarah's eyes flicked back to his. Filled with a mix of anger and pain. "Fix this? Do you have any idea what it was like? Raising him alone? Watching him grow up and wondering every day if I made the right decision to keep him safe from you?" Ryan's heart clenched. "I didn't know. Sarah. I swear. If I had." "You didn't want to know," she interrupted. Her voice sharp. "You shut me out. You blocked my number. Ignored every letter. Every attempt I made to tell you. You were too busy building your empire in Chicago to care about what you left behind." The truth of her words stung. But Ryan didn't argue. She was right, he had been too consumed with proving himself. With escaping the small-town life he had deemed too constraining. And in doing so, he had lost everything that truly mattered. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was selfish. And I put my ambitions above the people who loved me. But I've changed. Sarah. I'm not the same man who left Ashwood." Her expression softened slightly, though the pain lingered in her eyes. "It's not me you need to convince, Ryan. It's Jake." Hearing his son's name sent a wave of longing through him. "I want to meet him," he said firmly. "I want to get to know him. To be a part of his life. But only if you'll let me." Sarah sighed. Her shoulders sagging as the tension began to drain from her posture. "Jake is smart, smarter than either of us probably give him credit for. He's going to have questions. And I don't want him to get hurt. He's been through enough already." Ryan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I won't hurt him. I promise. I'll take this at whatever pace you think is best." They sat in silence for a moment. The clatter of dishes and murmured conversations filling the space between them. Finally, Sarah spoke. Her tone softer. "He has a baseball game tomorrow. After school. If you want to come, you can watch." Ryan's chest tightened at the offer. A mix of gratitude and nervous anticipation surging within him. "Thank you," he said. His voice thick with emotion. Sarah stood. Her hands brushing down her jeans. "Don't thank me yet, Ryan. This is about Jake. Not us." As she walked out of the diner, Ryan leaned back in his seat, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was a small step. But it was a step nonetheless. And for the first time since he returned to Ashwood, he felt a glimmer of hope. The next afternoon, Ryan found himself standing at the edge of the baseball field. His hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. The stands were filled with parents and siblings, their cheers and chatter creating a lively atmosphere. On the field, a group of boys in bright uniforms warmed up, their laughter and shouts carrying on the breeze. Ryan's eyes immediately found Jake. The boy stood on the pitcher's mound, adjusting his cap with a focused determination that Ryan recognized as his own. Watching him, Ryan felt a surge of pride. This was his son, a boy who had Sarah's gentle heart but carried pieces of Ryan within him. 2. Here's the starting pitcher, a voice said beside him. Ryan turned to see Sarah. Her arms crossed as she watched the game. Best strike average in the league. Ryan smiled faintly. His incredible. Sarah's expression softened. Though her guard remained. He works hard. It's something he got from his grandmother. The mention of Elizabeth brought a pang of guilt. But also a sense of gratitude. His grandmother had been there when he wasn't. Ensuring Jake had the love and support he needed. As the game began, Ryan found himself swept up in the excitement. Every pitch, every swing of the bat felt like a moment frozen in time. When Jake struck out the opposing team's star player, Ryan couldn't stop himself from cheering. Sarah glanced at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. By the time the game ended, with Jake's team victorious, Ryan knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. He was determined to earn his place in Jake's life, no matter how long it took. Ryan leaned against the chain-link fence at the edge of the baseball field, watching as Jake celebrated the team's victory with his friends. The boy's grin was wide and infectious. His cheeks flushed from the excitement of the game. Ryan's chest swelled with pride as he observed the easy camaraderie Jake shared with his teammates. But the joy was bittersweet. He couldn't help but think about how many of these moments he had already missed. Sarah stood nearby, her arms crossed but her posture relaxed. He did well today, she said softly, breaking the silence. He did more than well, Ryan replied, his eyes fixed on Jake. He was incredible. Every move he made out there, it's like he's been doing this forever. She nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. He's been playing since he could hold a bat. Elizabeth always said baseball was in his blood. The mention of his grandmother brought a pang of guilt. And Ryan turned to Sarah. She was there for him when I wasn't. I'll never be able to thank her enough for that. Sarah's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. She loved him. She wanted him to have the support and stability he needed. That's why she never gave up on you. Even when you gave up on us. Ryan swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him. He wanted to respond, but before he could, Jake ran up to them, his excitement bubbling over. Mom, did you see my strikeout in the third inning? That pitch was perfect. Jake's eyes shone as he reenacted the throw, his arms mimicking the motion with exaggerated enthusiasm. I saw, Sarah said, laughing. You were amazing. Sweetheart. Ryan knelt to Jake's level, unable to resist joining the moment. You know, that was a textbook fastball. Have you been practicing that grip? Jake looked at him, surprised but pleased. Yeah. Coach showed me how to hold it last week. Do you know a lot about pitching? Ryan chuckled, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. I used to pitch when I was your age. Maybe we can practice together sometime? Jake hesitated, glancing at his mother for approval. Sarah's expression was unreadable, but after a moment, she nodded. It might be good for you to learn a few tricks from someone who's been there. Okay, Jake said, grinning. But only if you can keep up with me. Ryan laughed, his heart swelling as he ruffled Jake's hair. Oh, I think I'll manage. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, but Ryan's thoughts raced. The connection he felt with Jake, even in those few minutes, was undeniable. He had missed so much, but the bond was there, waiting to be nurtured. When he reached his suite, his phone buzzed incessantly. He glanced at the screen to find a flurry of messages and missed calls from Chicago. Bernard Wilson, the chairman of the Carter Enterprises board, had left several voicemails, each more urgent than the last. Ryan sighed and called back. Bernard picked up on the first ring. Ryan, where the hell have you been? We've got a crisis on our hands. The Miller contract is on the verge of collapse. And the board is calling for an emergency meeting. You need to get back here. Now. I'm in Vermont. Ryan replied evenly. I told you I'd be here for a few months. You don't have a few months. Bernard's voice rose in frustration. The shareholders are panicking. They're already talking about replacing you if you don't step in and fix this. Ryan's grip tightened on the phone as he glanced at the window, where the lights of Ashwood twinkled in the distance. A few days ago, the prospect of losing everything he had built in Chicago would have terrified him. Now, it felt insignificant compared to what was at stake here. I'm not coming back, Ryan said firmly. There was a stunned silence on the other end. You're serious? Bernard finally said, his tone disbelieving. You're going to throw away your career for what? Some small-town fantasy? Ryan's jaw clenched. This isn't a fantasy, Bernard. It's my family. And I've already lost too much time with them. Ryan, you're making a mistake. The company needs you. Without your leadership, they'll manage. Ryan interrupted, his voice resolute. I've made my decision. If the board wants to replace me, so be it. He hung up before Bernard could respond, a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in years, Ryan felt like he was choosing something real, something that mattered. The next morning, Ryan stood outside Sarah's house, his hands trembling slightly as he knocked on the door. She opened it, surprised to see him so early. What are you doing here? She asked, her tone cautious. I just wanted to say thank you, Ryan said, his voice steady, for letting me see Jake, for giving me a chance to be part of his life. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm going to do everything I can to make this right. Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. It's a start, she said softly. As he walked back to his car, Ryan felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he needed to be. The following weeks in Ashwood marked the beginning of a transformation for Ryan. Not just in the way he viewed his life but in how he carried himself. Days were no longer filled with endless meetings or late-night strategy sessions for Carter Enterprises. Instead, his time was consumed by something far more important, reconnecting with his son and rebuilding the bridges he had burned years ago. One Saturday afternoon, Ryan found himself in the backyard of Sarah's modest home, standing next to Jake as the boy enthusiastically explained his plans for the treehouse they had started building together. Ryan had offered to help Jake with the project after discovering the boy's interest in construction. It was a way to bond. A shared effort that required patience, teamwork, and trust, all things Ryan was eager to nurture. See, Dad, we can put a pulley system here, Jake said, pointing to a rough sketch he had drawn. That way, I can pull up supplies and maybe even snacks. Ryan smiled at the way Jake's eyes sparkled with excitement. That's a great idea, he said, crouching down to get a better look at the boy's plan. We'll need some strong rope and a good pulley wheel. I can show you how to anchor it to the beams. You've built stuff like this before, right? Jake asked, tilting his head with curiosity. Not exactly treehouses, Ryan admitted. But when I was younger, your grandfather taught me how to build small projects. And later, when I started my business, I learned about construction on a much bigger scale. Jake nodded, taking it all in. So, you're kind of like an architect. Ryan laughed. Not quite, but close enough. Maybe one day, you'll be an architect or a builder. Or whatever you want to be. The boy grinned. Maybe. But first, I want to finish this treehouse. Sarah watched the scene from the back porch, her arms folded across her chest. There was a warmth in her eyes as she saw her son and Ryan working together. It was a sight she hadn't allowed herself to imagine for years. And now that it was here, she found it both comforting and bittersweet. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the sky, Ryan and Sarah sat on the porch steps, sipping cups of coffee. Jake had fallen asleep inside after an afternoon of hauling wood and hammering nails, his small body exhausted but happy. He's a great kid, Ryan said, breaking the comfortable silence. He is. Sarah agreed, her voice soft. And he deserves a father who's there for him. Ryan turned to her, his expression earnest. I want to be that father. Sarah. I know I've missed so much already. But I'm here now. And I'm staying. She looked at him, studying his face for a moment before replying. It's not just about being here, Ryan. It's about proving to Jake that you're not going to disappear again. He's had enough disappointment in his life. I won't disappear, Ryan said firmly. I'm done running. The sincerity in his voice struck something deep within Sarah. She wanted to believe him. But trust didn't come easily after years of hurt. Still, the change in him was undeniable. He wasn't the same man who had left Ashwood all those years ago. In the days that followed, Ryan's commitment to Jake and Sarah only grew stronger. He began showing up at Jake's school events, cheering him on at games, and helping with homework. For the first time, Jake started to see Ryan not just as a man from his past, but as someone who might have a real place in his future. One afternoon, Ryan decided to visit his grandmother's mansion. While sorting through Elizabeth's study, he discovered an old, carefully sealed box with his name written on it in her elegant handwriting. Inside were dozens of letters she had written to him but never sent. The first one was dated 6 years earlier, around the time Jake was born. In the letter, Elizabeth wrote about meeting Jake for the first time, describing him as a reflection of you, Ryan, in all the best ways. She had pleaded with him to return, to see for himself the miracle he had unknowingly created. Letter after letter detailed milestones in Jake's life, his first steps, his love of baseball, his insatiable curiosity. Each page was filled with love and a sense of longing that made Ryan's throat tighten. Why didn't I listen? He murmured, his voice breaking. I could have been there. Carol, who had been tidying the room, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Elizabeth always believed you'd find your way back, Ryan. She knew it would take time, but she never doubted it. Ryan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I have to make this right. For Jake. For Sarah. For all of us. That evening, Ryan joined Sarah and Jake for dinner at their home. The atmosphere was warm and lively, filled with laughter and the sound of Jake recounting his day at school. After dinner, while Jake worked on a drawing at the table, Ryan turned to Sarah. I want to rebuild something bigger than just our family, he said. Something that connects the past and the future. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I've been thinking about moving Carter Enterprises headquarters here to Ashwood. Ryan explained. It started here, with my grandfather's construction company. It feels right to bring it back home. Sarah stared at him, her surprise evident. That's a big decision. Ryan. Are you sure? More than ever, he replied. It's time to stop chasing what doesn't matter and focus on what does. You. Jake, this town. This is where I belong. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to hope that their broken family could truly heal. Ryan wasn't just saying the right words, he was taking the steps to prove he meant them. And as they sat together, watching Jake add the finishing touches to his treehouse drawing, it felt like the beginning of something new. Something whole. The morning air in Ashwood was fresh and invigorating as Ryan stepped outside. The faint sound of hammers and saws echoing from a nearby construction site. Carter Enterprises was beginning to take root in Ashwood, with plans for a new headquarters underway. For Ryan, the decision to relocate the company was more than a business move, it was a declaration of belonging. After years of chasing success in Chicago, he was finally investing in something that truly mattered. That day, Ryan had promised to meet Jake and Sarah at Lake Haven for a picnic. It was a place filled with memories for Ryan and Sarah, the site of their first kiss, their shared dreams, and, in many ways, the foundation of their relationship. As Ryan drove toward the lake, a basket of sandwiches and snacks in the passenger seat, He couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had shifted in just a few weeks. He was no longer the man who defined himself by his career or his wealth. For the first time, he felt anchored, purposeful. When he arrived at the lake, Jake was already there, crouched by the shore with a fishing rod in hand. Sarah stood nearby, the sunlight catching in her hair as she waved to Ryan. The sight filled him with a warmth he hadn't known he was missing. "You're late," Jake teased as Ryan approached, holding up a small fish he had just caught. "Mom says you were probably working." Ryan laughed, ruffling Jake's hair. "I was making sandwiches. Thank you very much. I'll have you know I make a mean peanut butter and jelly." Sarah smirked. "Guess we'll have to see if it passes Jake's taste test." They spread out a blanket near the water, the afternoon unfolding in a series of small, perfect moments. Jake chattered about his school projects and plans for the treehouse, his enthusiasm contagious. Ryan and Sarah listened, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the lake birds chirping, the gentle lap of water against the shore. After lunch, Jake ran off to explore the woods nearby, leaving Ryan and Sarah alone. The conversation drifted to lighter topics at first, memories of their youth, funny stories about Jake, but gradually, it turned to the deeper issues they had avoided. "You've changed," Sarah said softly, her eyes searching his face. "The Ryan I knew wouldn't have come back. He wouldn't have stayed. I had to," Ryan admitted, his voice low. "Losing you. Not knowing Jake, it created a hole I tried to fill with everything else. Money, success, power. But none of it mattered." "Not really." Sarah looked away, her fingers brushing over the fabric of the blanket. "It's hard for me to trust that you won't leave again. I've built a life here. For me and Jake. We've been fine on our own." "I know," Ryan said, his tone gentle but firm. "You've done an incredible job raising him. Sarah. He's kind, smart, resilient, all because of you. But I don't want you to have to do it alone anymore." She met his gaze, her expression softening. "It's not just about Jake. It's about us. We were good together once. But we also hurt each other. That doesn't just go away. I don't expect it to." Ryan replied, "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild what we had. One step at a time." Before Sarah could respond, Jake came running back, his hands full of wildflowers. "Mom, Dad, look what I found. Can we take them home?" Ryan froze at the word dad. Jake had never called him that before. Sarah glanced at Ryan, her eyes glistening with unspoken emotion. "Of course, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "We'll put them in a vase when we get home." Jake beamed, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, and sat down between them, sorting through his bouquet. Ryan watched him, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. It was a small gesture, but to Ryan, it felt monumental, a sign that he was finally becoming the father Jake deserved. That evening, back at Sarah's house, Ryan stayed for dinner. Jake had insisted, declaring that they needed to finalize plans for the treehouse. As the boy talked excitedly about paint colors and secret compartments, Ryan and Sarah shared a glance across the table, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. After Jake went to bed, Ryan lingered in the living room. He felt the weight of the engagement ring in his pocket, a constant reminder of the life he wanted to build with Sarah. But he didn't pull it out. Not yet. Instead, he turned to Sarah, who was tidying up in the kitchen. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. She looked at him, puzzled. "For what?" "For giving me another chance. For letting me be here." Sarah's expression softened, and for the first time in years, she smiled at him the way she used to, with warmth, with hope. "We're still figuring this out, Ryan. But I'm glad you're here, too." As Ryan drove back to the hotel that night, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew that. But for the first time, He felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for a future, for a family, and for the love that had never truly left him. As the sun set over the serene town of Ashwood, Ryan stood in the backyard of their new home, watching Jake play in the treehouse they had built together. Sarah walked out to join him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. In that moment, everything felt complete, a family united not by perfection but by love, forgiveness, and the courage to rebuild. Ryan had learned that true success wasn't about wealth or power, it was about the bonds we nurture and the memories we create. Together, they had crafted a future built on trust and second chances. As laughter filled the air, Ryan smiled, knowing he was exactly where he belonged. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Life Stories, for more inspiring tales of love, growth, and redemption. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts.